Welcome to this specialized training module on IT governance and management, with a specific focus on IT vendor management. In today's interconnected ecosystem, no organization is an island. We rely on third parties for software, infrastructure, and services. However, outsourcing a function does not outsource the responsibility. Today, we will explore the life cycle of vendor management, from selection and contracting to monitoring and termination, ensuring you have the tools to govern these relationships effectively and securely. Let's begin by positioning vendor management within the IT governance framework. Governance is about setting the direction, while management is about execution. Vendor management isn't just about paying bills. It is a strategic function. As stated in our sources, the suppliers and service providers that IT selects should reflect IT and business priorities. We must decide on A, sourcing strategy. Do we insource, hiring employees? Do we outsource to consultants? Or do we use a hybrid approach? The goal is often to save costs or access expert skills not available internally. However, remember this golden rule of governance. You can outsource the work, but you cannot outsource the accountability. If a vendor fails, the organization ultimately bears the impact. This flowchart visualizes the governance decision process. It starts with IT governance, setting the strategy. This leads to a sourcing decision: insourced, outsourced, or hybrid. If we choose outsourced or hybrid, we trigger the vendor management lifecycle. This lifecycle selection, contracting, monitoring, and termination is the roadmap we will follow for the rest of this presentation. The success of a vendor relationship is often determined before the contract is even signed. It starts with selection and due diligence. You must establish clear requirements first. You cannot select the right partner if you don't know what you need. We typically use a request for proposal, RFP process, to get structured responses from the market. But selection isn't just about price. You must conduct due diligence. Is the vendor financially stable? Do they have market credibility? You must also assess the risk. Does this vendor access critical systems? If so, their security becomes your security. Never skip reference checks or pilot evaluations. This sequence diagram outlines the selection workflow. First, the organization defines its requirements internally. Then, it issues an RFP or RFI to the vendor. The vendor submits a proposal. Crucially, the organization then conducts due diligence, checking financials, security, and references before making the final selection. This linear process ensures objectivity and risk reduction. Once a vendor is selected, we move to contracting. The contract is your primary governance tool. It must explicitly define roles and responsibilities so there is no ambiguity. A critical component of the contract is the Service Level Agreement, SLA. An SLA defines the specific, measurable performance targets the vendor must meet, such as system availability or support response times. As auditors, we look for specific clauses. Does the contract define data ownership? Does it protect intellectual property? Most importantly, does it include a right to audit clause? This empowers you to verify the vendor's controls, rather than just taking their word for it. This mind map breaks down the essential components of a robust vendor contract. At the core is the contract itself. Branching out, we see roles and responsibilities. We see the SLA branch, which includes metrics and penalties. We have data protection, covering confidentiality and ownership. Finally, the right to audit branch ensures we have access to logs and the ability to perform site visits. Signing the contract is not the end. It's the beginning of service level management, SLM. You must actively manage the SLA. This involves monitoring performance against the agreed metrics. If the vendor agreed to 99.9% uptime, are they hitting it? You need performance reports that compare actual results to these targets. If targets are missed, the contract should specify penalties or financial credits. This accountability is essential. Furthermore, business needs change. SLM involves reviewing the SLA periodically to ensure it still aligns with your current business reality. This state diagram shows the cycle of SLA management. We start by defining the SLA. We then enter a cycle of monitoring performance. We evaluate that performance against the target. If the target is missed, we apply penalties and return to monitoring. If the target is met, we continue service. Periodically, We review the SLA itself to see if updates are needed, closing the loop back to definition. Security is a paramount concern in vendor management. You must strictly control third-party access. Vendors should only access the specific data fields necessary for their work, nothing more. You must also conduct periodic security assessments. Does the vendor train their staff? Do they patch their systems? In cloud relationships, SaaS or IaaS, ensure your data is segregated and encrypted. A critical, often overlooked aspect is incident response. Your contract must force the vendor to notify you immediately if they are breached. Also, consider fourth-party risk. Who are your vendor's vendors? You need visibility into that chain as well. This diagram illustrates the flow of risk. The organization shares data with the vendor. The vendor may subcontract to a fourth party. Risks flow backwards along this chain. Therefore, risk controls must be applied to both the vendor and their subcontractors. We apply access limits and audit rights specifically to the vendor to mitigate these risks. How do we know the vendor is actually secure? We rely on auditing and assurance. We often use independent third-party audits, such as SOC1 or SOC2 reports, Service Organization Control. These reports are independent attestations of the vendor's control environment, covering security, availability, and confidentiality. It is not enough to just collect these reports. Management must review them to find any noted exceptions or failures. If the report is 6 months old, we request a bridge letter to certify that controls haven't changed since the audit date. The flow of assurance starts with the vendor engaging an independent auditor. The auditor produces a society report. This report is submitted to the client organization. The client must review it. We check for exceptions. If issues are found, we request remediation. If the report is clean, we file and monitor. This active review is key to governance. Cloud computing adds specific nuances to vendor management. You must understand the deployment model, private versus public versus hybrid, as each carries different risk profiles. You must also understand the service model, IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS. In IaaS, you manage the OS. In SaaS, the vendor does. A major concern in the cloud is data segregation, ensuring your data is isolated from other customers. While a physical right to audit is hard to enforce with giants like AWS or Azure, you must ensure the SLA includes a right to review their third-party certifications. Encryption is your final line of defense, especially if you manage the keys. This visual comparison clarifies responsibilities. In SaaS, the vendor manages almost everything: app, data, OS. In PaaS, the vendor manages the OS and hardware, while you manage the app and data. In IaaS, the vendor manages only the hardware, leaving the OS, app, and data to you. Understanding where the line is drawn is crucial for assigning security controls. Finally, all relationships end. You must have a termination and exit strategy. A common governance failure is vendor lock-in, where it is too expensive or difficult to leave. You must identify these hooks before signing. The contract must specify exactly how and when your data will be returned to you in a usable format. Upon termination, you must immediately revoke all access rights, physical badges, and network logins. Governance ensures that when a vendor leaves, they don't take your business capability or data with them. The timeline of a vendor exit begins at planning, defining the strategy in the contract. When the termination event occurs, we trigger the exit clause. We move to transition, where data is returned, access is revoked, and knowledge is transferred. Finally, at closure, we make the final payment only after all conditions are met.